Good morning, Broncos fans. I'm Thomas Hall, your host for Legends of Mile High, a show that blends history with current events. And the ultimate goal is to keep this storied history of the franchise alive, even in the minds of the most recent of fans. And and today we'll be talking about Russell Wilson and his unexplained or sudden decline from his usual self, I would say. And we're going to be comparing that with some historical legends of the past, including a legend who is well known in Broncos country. So thank you for joining. If you hit that like button, I'd appreciate it. Subscribe to Mile High Huddle YouTube. Clinton Watson coming in this morning already with a super chat. I really appreciate that, Clinton. Thanks for being here with us this morning. I wanted to holler to the DWI guys, Deanna, Najaf, and the Duchess, and y'all. Thanks for keeping it real, and Merry Christmas. And thank you, Clinton. Thank you for coming in. Thank you for that super chat. I really, really appreciate it. That's why we're here to spread the Broncos love, even if they are doing poorly. So I appreciate that, and Merry Christmas to you and to all the others that you mentioned on this on the stream here. I appreciate it. So let's talk Russell Wilson. Obviously, people are kind of scratching their heads about what happened to Russell Wilson. Why is he all of a sudden not a great quarterback, especially after being traded to the Broncos when we all were hoping that he was going to change the fortunes that we've all suffered through for the last several seasons? Well, it's hard to say what his real issues are. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of speculation about it. Is it Hackett? Is he in massive decline? Is he injured? We don't really know the culprit, but what we can do is we can look at some very good quarterbacks in the future in the past to kind of explain what might happen in the future. Now, I have some good news and some bad news, depending on which of the quarterbacks you want to look at. But there are several quarterbacks that you can use as a guide to what happens when a legendary quarterback has a sudden unexplained drop off. And some of them come back, and some of them don't. So one of the most interesting, and I'll first before I jump into this, I'll explain how I actually did this. So I have taken every quarterback that had a qualifying season, basically, who started about at least 60% of their games each year, and I've adjusted those major statistical categories for era. So I've looked at the 5-year period around that quarterback season and compared to the mean. So I was able to then take all those quarterbacks and compare them side by side. When you adjust for era, you can actually do that, which is pretty interesting and fun, and also gives you some comparable insight into what they look like up against other quarterbacks. And in this situation, what happened to those quarterbacks after this decline like Russell Wilson has had? So first, let's talk about a little bit about Russell Wilson. So Russell Wilson is obviously not doing what we expected. So his completion percentage is definitely off from his average. He typically has a completion percentage on average around 65%. He's around 58% right now. So that's a massive drop off. And the other massive drop off is his touchdowns per game. That's significantly off. He usually averages about 1.8 per game, and he's sitting around 0.8, which is pretty ugly for a quarterback of his pay grade, I would say. The other statistic, and that affects ratings. So his ratings down, obviously, too, compared to his average was 102, which is what we all expected. He'd be about over 100 and be, the offense would be clicking and whatnot. So those are some pretty ugly drop offs. His yards per game actually is right above his average, which is interesting. And his interceptions per game are right at his average. So a couple of his measures, a couple of those major statistical categories are in line for what we were expecting. But it's really the completion percentage and the TDs per game that are just ugly, ugly. And before I go on, I just want to say good morning to Dom. Dom, thank you for coming in. Good morning, Thomas Scott and Broncos Country, Denver Broncos for life. Thank you for being here almost every morning, and I appreciate you coming in and saying that. So thank you for the support. Really, really appreciate you being here in the morning. So when we start to think about that, we look at how massive is his drop off compared to others. Well, if we, I mean, he could turn it around all of a sudden, which I doubt. But say he continues this path, that's going to be a 30% drop off from his best season. Now that's pretty big, and really it's a 9% drop off from his worst season before this, which when you look at it that way, it's not too bad, but it's still pretty bad, especially for Broncos fans. We were expecting so much more, but when you start to look at those type of numbers, you can see that this isn't really unprecedented. It's happened before. It's happened actually a few times in the past, and I'm really only going to talk about kind of legendary quarterbacks here because there are only a handful of quarterbacks who have had at least four 80th percentile adjusted for error seasons, and Russell Wilson's one of them. And most of those quarterbacks have gone to the Hall of Fame. So I'm not going to go into quarterbacks who are kind of average for their career and look at them. I'm looking at comparable quarterbacks, and Russell Wilson really was on trajectory for the Hall of Fame based on his statistics, based on his Super Bowl win and things like that. So going to the Super Bowl 2 times early in his career. So we're not going to focus on a lot of these others, but legendary quarterbacks is who we'll be talking about. So Jeremy Sean, good morning. Good morning, Thomas. He says, thank you very much, Jeremy, for coming in. Appreciate it. I appreciate you being here almost every morning. So thank you very much. So there are a few quarterbacks that had about a 30% drop off from their best season in kind of their, what I would say, their middle-aged part of their quarterbacking years. So, anywhere from, older quarterbacks, from the past, they didn't play as long, but anybody from around, say 29 to 33, which is about, what Russell Wilson would be, who had drop-offs. And interestingly enough, one of the most comparable quarterbacks actually in for his entire career, really. Obviously, he won a few more championships than Russell Wilson, but statistically wise, was Bart Starr. Incredibly consistent. If you plot them both on a line chart, how they adjusted for error, how they really compared. And Bart Starr had an incredible season earlier. Had a few incredible seasons earlier in his career, and then he had a massive drop off at 33, which was 27%, almost 30% off from his best season, which, interestingly enough, came the season after his massive drop off. So that is good news when you think about it. I mean, Bart Starr, legendary quarterback, Green Bay Packers, all the championships, first 2 Super Bowls, but to consider that he had a massive drop off, just like Russell Wilson did, and then came back the next season and had his best season of his career, which was, a top 80th percentile season. So that's some good news. A couple others that have had that happen too. Brian Sipe, but he's he had one of those same massive drop offs at 33. He had some incredible seasons, and but the problem with his drop off was he never really came back from it. And he did have a better season the next season, which was quite an increase. But the problem was he left the NFL and never came back. He went to got a contract with USFL, and that was it for him. He never came back to the NFL and did anything. So it's hard to say what he would have done the following season and whatnot. But yeah, his drop off was pretty massive too. 39% from his best season. So these aren't unprecedented things to see a legendary quarterback have a massive drop off. Unfortunately, we're the ones watching it as Denver Broncos fans, and it's a shame to see. So there's a few others that we can talk about as well, and I'm actually going to write this up, and you'll be able to see the graphs that I'm looking at. You'll be able to see the numbers at milehighhuddle.com. So don't forget to go to milehighhuddle.com. I know we do these shows and provide interesting information, but there are a lot of writers who put out some great stuff. So go visit the site and read it, and I'll post it on Twitter when I do have this done, so you guys can all see what I'm looking at, and then you can decide if I'm crazy or not. The next the next quarterback I want to talk about is Fran Tarkenton. Fran Tarkenton also had a 30% drop off when he was 31, and Fran Tarkenton was an amazing quarterback and legendary Hall of Famer. And he'd bounced around to a couple different teams. In his days with the Minnesota Vikings, he took him to the Super Bowl. Obviously, they never won one, but he also had that, kind of dip in his career, unexplained. He was. It could be some injuries and things like that, but it was a huge drop from what people were used to. And then he came back, and he not only came back strong, he had after that season had 4 seasons in the 80th percentile adjusted for era. So that's some more good news, right? So you can say, okay, I I get that's something we can all kind of hold on to and say maybe Russell Wilson will come back. So it's interesting to consider. So I'm giving you both sides of the story here. Jeremy Sean, just wanted to grab one of your comments. The thing I'm struggling to understand is the processing. I get a decline in physical ability, speed ability, but the decision making has been awful and puzzling. It's basic reading the field stuff. Yeah, that's a huge concern, and that's part of the problem, right? Like, we're trying to talk about what could happen in the future, but what's happening now, and it's hard to explain. Part of this is he's just been sacked so many times, it's incredible. So maybe he's a little bit feeling the pressure, or he's just more worried about getting sacked. So I don't really know what the problem is now, but I will say this: another legendary quarterback who we all hold dear to our hearts was John Elway. Now, John Elway was physically gifted, amazing, probably the most physically gifted quarterback we've seen, really, that went to the Hall of Fame. I would say his physical tools were, his arm strength and his ability to throw the ball was far better and stronger than most of the other quarterbacks that have come before and after him. And he struggled early on. He had one great season in '87, and then he was pretty mediocre after that. And then he got an offense that worked for him later in his life. He has more top seasons adjusted for error, more 80th percentile seasons adjusted for era than any other quarterback after in the twilight of his career. And that's because he got an offense that worked for him. Shanahan brought in an offense, and that offense worked incredibly well. It had a great running game, obviously, but it fit John Elway's style better. And the scheme got receivers open. Shanahan was great at getting receivers open using that scheme. And he actually really brought in the 2 pieces that Hackett was supposed to bring in: the West Coast offense and the zone blocking scheme. But he did it correctly. So part of me thinks that, it's a lot on the offense. So, Hackett's offense doesn't work. It doesn't work how it's supposed to be working. And there's injuries. You look at, KJ Hamler hasn't played much. Jerry Jeudy's hurt. Tim Patrick hasn't played a game because he got injured early. in the preseason, off season. So, and then lost Javonte Williams. Their line has been banged up. So there's injuries, which is contributing to it. And the offense isn't very good. And I think maybe from my perspective, if a new offense came in that fit Russell Wilson right, and there wasn't so many injuries, it's probably going to be a better season for him. And I know that Russell Wilson came out of the gate pretty bad. And part of that, I think, has to do with no preseason. And, they're starting to try and get stuff going. And then they started having injuries. So there was never this time where he'd gotten comfortable with the offense. The offense was clicking, and there were players who weren't injured. So I think there's a lot of contributing factors. But I think it starts. I mean, the responsibility starts at the top, which is Nathaniel Hackett. He is the leader of the team. All the responsibility should flow to him, and he should be the one that takes the brunt of it. And I think at the end of the season he will. But think about it in that perspective: is it Russell Wilson all of a sudden is just super terrible, or are there a lot of contributing factors? And I think it's a lot of contributing factors, and I think Russell Wilson just isn't comfortable in this offense at all, and he's just not comfortable on the field right now. But that doesn't mean that we need to start exploring what his dead cap hit's going to be next year and see if we can, if the Broncos can release him, because that's not going to happen. We and the Broncos have to hope that this is one of those downturns that comes back, like I'm talking about. There have been quarterbacks that have not come back from it. And that's, as I go through this, you'll see a couple more, but there have been some legendary quarterbacks who are in the Hall of Fame who came back and boom, we're better. Dom, thanks for coming back in. They need to change the whole culture. Absolutely. In fact, I wrote an article in Mile High Huddle about that specifically. There are players who, and I wrote about 3 specific players who are good, who I would hate to see gone from this team because of their talent, but they've known nothing but losing, right? I mean, Justin Simmons came in and, he wasn't a starter his first season in 2016, but after he became a starter, he has never had a winning season in the NFL. I mean, that's just, at some point, that's what right? And Garrett Bowles is another. Came in 2017, never has known a winning season in the NFL. Cortland Sutton's another, and there's a few others that you could talk about. I mean, the young ones, the last 2 or 3 years, you got to hang on to them and see if they can turn it around. But sometimes it's just they've instilled this losing culture, and that happened. I mean, when Pat Bowlen had to step down, and then you had the whole ownership issues. You've got a couple terrible coaches in there that didn't know what they were doing. You had some bad quarterbacking, and all of a sudden it's just losing. And I mean, you can point to some of these other teams like the Detroit Lions and the Cleveland Browns who have, been long-suffering teams and have had a history of losing, and they just continue to lose. I mean, the Detroit Lions haven't won a playoff game, have only won 1 playoff game since 1953. I mean, that's a culture of losing. And at some point, something that needs to change. And but what we're seeing is change. We're seeing a complete overhaul. New GM, fairly. You got new ownership, and you had a new coach, which obviously he's not doing well. But there is some progress, but there's still some of that kind of losing mentality, even though they may not think it. That's what they're used to. So I think some of that needs to be cleansed. Kamani Dixon, I appreciate you coming in from Facebook. Thank you. Yes, I agree. They should have played during the preseason, and I think so too. I mean, at this point, I was kind of on board with it because I didn't want major players to get injured. But I'll tell you what, they got injured anyway. I mean, the Broncos are the most injured team in the league. It's incredible. So what was the point of all that? They all got injured anyway. So maybe clicking coming out of the gate would have set them up for a little bit of future, into the future of the season. Had a few more wins to start out and not be, so down when everybody's injured. And that's the problem with football, man. It's a war of attrition. And at some point when you lose talented players, you just can't come back from it. And not only that, they traded Bradley Chubb. So they're losing talented players to injury, and then they traded one away. So this is not unexpected at this point. I mean, this is, as you lose so many talented players, it's hard to win in the NFL. So thank you for that comment, Kamani. I appreciate it. I want to go to one comment in history. Jeremy Sean, Shanahan's downfall was selecting personnel. Could you envision a Mike Shanahan coach team with Peyton as GM with a Wilson contract? We need to try and salvage his game. I agree with you to a certain extent, because Shanahan at the beginning had made some masterful moves as a GM, right? Like, he brought in key players for that Super Bowl run through free agency, and he made some pretty decent draft picks to begin with that that really helped that team kind of come together and win those two Super Bowls. And he also was lucky that, a couple of the other players who had been drafted or traded for or came through free agency before he got there were still around. Like Gary Zimmerman came in via trade before he became the head coach. So he was really, I mean, everything kind of clicked to begin with, kind of like John Elway, in his early part of his career. And then you're right, he got too. I think he got a little too cute in the draft. I mean, at one point he drafted three defensive backs, three cornerbacks in the second and third round, when he definitely needed to fill in some other spots, and he had to kept relying on those free agents. Well, those free agents never panned out, so that was his downfall. I think he had started at some point started to realize his mistake, but it was a little too late. He just couldn't recover from that. I think he is starting to figure out that the draft was a little bit more important than free agency, and but it was a little too late. He was fired, and unfortunately, and then the chain events happened, and we got to Super Bowl 50. So that was okay. But yeah, you're right. He did. I think pairing Shanahan with a great GM would have been amazing, because Shanahan's offenses, even without John Elway, were pretty darn good. I mean, Jake Plummer wasn't a great quarterback, and those offenses were pretty good. And Brian Greasy actually had some success in that offense as well. So if you could have got a real quarterback in there, and I think Shanahan with Jay Cutler would have been a lot better. But you know what happened there? He just got fired, and then Cutler was gone, and that was it. But I think there was some stuff in place. But you're right, Jeremy. Thank you for that comment. I appreciate it. So I'm going to talk about another quarterback who we hope that Russell Wilson doesn't follow. Now, he's not not a true legend, but man, he had some incredible passing season. That was Boomer Esiason. Boomer Esiason was actually an incredible passer early in his career, and then he had one of the worst seasons at 31 of almost any quarterback, really. I mean, his adjusted for era stats was massive. The problem with Boomer Esiason, and this is why I am comparing him to what could happen in the future with Russell Wilson, is he never came back. I mean, he had massive drop off, and he went 3 years in a row where he just went into the tank, and then he kind of came back a little bit, had a nice season, and then he was, a couple years he was done. So let's hope that Russell Wilson isn't following in the Boomer Esiason mold, because that doesn't bode well for the future, especially when you pay him that much, obviously. But then we also have Kurt Warner to talk about. I mean, Kurt Warner, incredible seasons, right? Early on, he came out of nowhere with a great offense, and then he went to the Giants and was just awful. Didn't fit. He just didn't fit. And then he came back, went to the Cardinals, had some good seasons. So and his drop off at 33 was terrible. I mean, it was a massive drop off. Similar age to Russell Wilson. He was injured a couple seasons, so a couple of his seasons don't even count, because he wasn't able to play. But that was a bad season, and he was able to come back from it, so that was good. And let's hope that that we can see Russell Wilson do the same. Now, another one that's interesting is Brett Favre. That Brett Favre played forever, and he was always kind of one of those in and out, kind of up and down quarterbacks a little bit, especially later in his career. But um, at his when he was 26, it was his best season, incredible season, and then he just kind of dropped off rapidly in his early 30s. He had a couple pretty poor seasons, but then he came back and had several great seasons, all four of them in the top 80th percentile. So that's I mean that's another one to compare to. I mean, Favre was kind of one of those often sacked quarterbacks that just maybe with some injuries that were bothering him or whatever. So that's something to look at as well. What is Russell Wilson kind of like that, where he'd been sacked a lot, taking a lot of hits, and now he's kind of feeling that mentally and physically. And then is he going to be able to mentally come back from that next season? And I know their careers are probably not going to be very similar. I mean, they're different type of quarterbacks, but from a physical standpoint, is that's what happening to Russell Wilson. I mean, Russell Wilson was averaging over, I think, around 40 sacks a season for his career. And this season, he could be the most sacked quarterback of all time. He's on pace, almost on pace for it. So is that part of his contributing downcline? And will he be able to return? I mean, I have no love for Brett Favre, but mentally he was able to return from those seasons and those physical beatings and have some good seasons later in his football career. So that's another comparison that I think we need to look at. Like, is the physical beating the contributing factor to Russell Wilson's decline? And it in part, I think there's a lot of things. Dom, I appreciate you coming in. Ownership needs to be ruthless, like they were with the mama papa stores. They own Walmart. Yeah, I mean, I have some firsthand knowledge with Walmart. I used to work in retail. I did some site location and some M&A in the corporate office for supermarkets. And you're right, Walmart was ruthless. They would come into a store or come into a town and just decimate it. Stores would close and they'd be left standing with 50% market share. And, nobody could do anything about it. And these were in small towns, and in the bigger towns, they wanted to get to 30% market share, and they did. They just devastated stores. And you're right. I mean, I do not want them to run the Broncos like they ran Walmart, because this just doesn't work that way. The way they ran Walmart is totally different. If they tried to cheap out like they did with everyone in the corporate office, or all the people traveling, it's not going to work. But you're right; they do need to take a look at this team and say we need to cleanse, like you said, cleanse the losing culture, and that's going to there's going to be some tough decisions, and they're going to have to put some pressure on Peyton to do that. And I think Peyton maybe realizes that now, because he inherited a coach, and he made some good moves in the draft, and I think he realizes that there's more to it than just bringing in a new coach of his choice. So I think you're going to see some changes in the offseason, and some of them are going to be they're going to hurt, I think, but I think it's a necessary thing. And when you look back at Shanahan, when he came back to the Broncos as the head coach, he had to make some of those changes too. He got rid of some players that were that had been in that losing culture for a while. So I'm hoping so anyway. I hope some major changes happen, but Hackett is not working, and that is absolute truth in my mind. He is the leader. He went about this entire thing incorrectly. He doesn't hold people accountable, and when he does, it's way too late. So players just aren't responding to him. And maybe they like him, but he whatever it is, he's just not getting the players in the right position. He's not using the West Coast offense correctly. He's not using the zone blocking scheme correctly all the time. I mean, obviously he's dealing with the injuries too, same as Russell Wilson, but I just don't think I don't think he has what it takes to lead a team. And when you're a head coach, that's the ultimate goal, is to be able to lead the team, be able to take people from different walks of life, different skill sets, different mentalities, come up with a strategy, and then have that strategy unfold on game day. in a successful manner, and he has not been able to do that. So he, regardless of who he's brought in, I think he brought in a couple good coaches. I think he brought in some coaches that are questionable, but his inability to let go of the play calling duties early on when it wasn't working, it just shows that he doesn't have those leadership qualities that make for a good coach, a good head coach. He could be a good offensive coordinator somewhere, I think, but a good head coach, he just isn't it. And there's just too many mental mistakes. There's too many you know, fundamental mistakes when it comes to football that I can't I can't see Hackett lasting another year. And if he does, I think that's a mistake. Scott Dillon coming in. What coaches do you think could come in and turn Russ around? Well, I mean, that's an interesting, and thank you, Scott, for coming in. It's an interesting question. What coaches? I mean, there's a lot of people talking about Sean Payton. I think he's a good coach with the quarterback. So, I mean, you're gonna have to spend money and give up draft picks to get him, unfortunately. But it's hard to say. I know a lot of people throwing out Dan Quinn's name. I'm not sold on Dan Quinn. He had some success. I get it. I think when you look at his success, was it due to a little bit of Kyle Shanahan went to the playoffs? I mean, his teams, and not just in the Super Bowl. I mean, that was a historic crash in that Super Bowl. But Quinn is just, it's games too. He couldn't close out games. So I'm a little bit I don't know. I'm a little bit kind of gun shy to bring Dan Quinn in. I actually, I don't buy this whole bring in an experienced guy kind of nonsense because every second time around coach that you can see that had success, I can show you three that flat out were terrible. So it's the right coach, and if there was reasons so let's take Dan Quinn for example. If there are reasons why he failed, like that were beyond his control, so like Shanahan in L.A. when he was the Raiders coach, he failed because Al Davis hamstrung him the whole time. Right? He was still a good coach, but he couldn't install his offense. So those were reasons why he failed. But when I look at Dan Quinn, I mean, I'm looking at his defense as what failed. And he was supposed to be a defensive guru. Was it his mentality? Why did he fail? Why did he fail to like close out games so much? So for me, I don't really care if it's experience coach, unless it's somebody who is coming back that is, like you get Sean Payton or somebody like that, then that's fine. But someone who has won a Super Bowl and done it before, I could definitely see that. But Mike Tomlin, Dom saying he's not out. They'd be idiots in Steelers country to let Mike Tomlin go. He's an excellent coach, and I don't think they will. I actually don't think the Steelers ownership I don't think they're idiots. I think they're going to keep him around. But it would be cool if he would be the number one coach on the market if he was let go for sure. Scott, take a look how the general manager treated the defense. Absolutely. I think that was part of it too. Like they just did not get none of their draft picks really panned out. Like you're right. The Falcons, they didn't have good players on the defense. So that's part of it for sure. But I want to say that, some coaches are able to take lesser teams and do something with them. And I'm not saying that Dan Quinn can't, but I'll just say Nathaniel Hackett cannot for sure. So whoever comes back in, if it's a newer coach with less experience, they need to bring in more experience around him. And I think that was also another Hackett mistake is he brought in a lot of young coaching, got rid of some good coaches that were already in Broncos country, right? Munchak and stuff, and brought in some young coaches with not a lot of experience. And I think that was a mistake. So I'm not sure who to bring in. I think there's some up and coming coaches that could be talented. And I think Evero might even have a shot at it. I mean, that's one person who you can look at and say he really got his team, which was the defense, to respond and play well. And he put people in the right positions to win. And So I'm not sure who it is. I don't think uh, I would be disappointed with Dan Quinn as much. I mean, if he brought in the right offensive coordinator, right? That's the thing. And that was his big, I think that was another mistake that once Kyle Shanahan took the 49ers job, he brought in some questionable offensive coordinators, I think. So and when he had LaFleur on his team, right? Like, so there was a couple decisions that really was led to his downfall, that he would have to change. And are they fixable? So if you look at his defense, like Scott said, if the defense is, were good, he probably would have been a more successful coach. So if they had the right players around him, and if he was able to make that decision, the correct decision on offensive coordinator for Kyle Shanahan left, he might still be might still have been the Falcons coach for a while. So there's a few things that go into it, but I think he would be smart enough to know that Evero should stick around if he's not snatched up somewhere else. So um, Scott Dillon's coming back in. I think the team, even the defense, is in here we go again mode. I'm assuming that you're talking about the Broncos, and because we have been talking about Dan Quinn and the Falcons. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the defense held up its end of the bargain for as long as it could, and now their hearts really are kind of not into it. It's what it seems. When you get steamrolled in the running game, your heart's not into it. You're just not. And that's what's been happening the last couple of weeks with the Broncos. They just cannot stop the run. And I'll say there's some injuries. Obviously, those are piling up. Randy Gregory, the big free agent, hasn't played since week 4. Traded Bradley Chubb. There's obviously other injuries to the linebacking core. There's been significant injuries, people coming back from. Justin Simmons was on IR for a little bit. And, so there's a lot going into it. But I mean, their run defense was pretty good for the most part, and they just can't stop anybody now. And it's that so I think you're kind of right. Here we go again, another losing season. Why are we putting in so much effort every week when the offense isn't holding up their end of the bargain? And that's losing mentality right there. Here we go again. But so that's you've got a good point there. I think the defense is kind of folding, and you're going to see a different defense this last half of the season than we saw at the first half of the season, and that's unfortunate. And maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I hope we see both sides kind of turn it around, and we don't have to watch this ugly, ugly football any longer. But I doubt it. Um, so, thank you for that comment, Scott. I appreciate it. So I'm just going to wrap this up real quick, and then I'm going to hop off here. So I appreciate everybody jumping into the chat. I hope you like the discussion. Again, I'm going to be writing up what I was talking about, posting my Huddle. You can see it in more detail, read about it, see the graphs and whatnot. But there are obviously two ways this can go for Russell Wilson. He can turn it around, like Bart Starr and a couple of those others that I mentioned. And I think if things change for the better, the offense gets better, more fitting to his style. And I know that he was, had a hand in the playbook and whatnot, but I think he will get better because most of the time when these quarterbacks really had massive drop offs and stayed there, it was a lot of times due to other factors, so like major injuries and things like that. So Russell Wilson doesn't seem majorly injured. I mean, he's still playing. I mean, you look at Neil Lomax. I mean, the guy's arthritic hip. He couldn't play. He had to retire at 29. So things like that happen. And Russell Wilson has had some injuries. Obviously, he was injured this year, and last year he missed some games, but he's been pretty durable, and he's still out there playing. And when he does, when he has it together, you can see he can still throw the ball, and he can still hit his receivers pretty well. He can move okay. I mean, not like he used to. So I don't think it's a major injury problem. I think it's a mental thing a little bit, and I think it's an offensive thing a little bit. So I actually think that you'll see. I'm hoping. Maybe I'm just too optimistic, but I think you're going to see a turnaround next year if things change with the coaching. Obviously, a better offense, some better players. I mean, you got to think about too. Albert O just was supposed to be a great weapon for him to begin, and he's non-existent anymore. So there's a lot of factors going into this, but if the Broncos get to bring in a new coach with a new offensive system that is actually works for the players around him, especially Russell Wilson, I think you're going to see a turnaround. If they continue to go with Hackett and they continue with this offensive scheme that doesn't work, then no, you're going to see a decline, and it's going to be a huge bust. But I'm more along the lines of looking at like Bart Starr and Brett Favre and those players who did turn it around and had some great seasons later in their career, and that's where I think Russell Wilson's going to go. I mean, when you have a quarterback of his caliber, it's hard to say that he's done it at 33. I mean, this is a new era of football, new era of quarterbacking. So I'm hopefully I can, looking at this, I gave you both sides of the story, bad and good, but I hopefully give you all some confidence that this $250 million is not thrown into the garbage, that this is going to change it around, and we're going to see Russell Wilson kind of get back to his old self, and maybe not as great as he was, but not as bad as he is now. And you'll see some turnaround. That's what I'm hoping for. And I hope it starts next season, because Broncos country needs it. We have been suffering for far too long. And I know we haven't suffered as long as some other football fandoms out there. Like I mentioned before, the Browns and the Lions, but the Broncos are historically a great franchise, and we need that to turn around right away. So here's hoping. Thank you for joining, everybody. I really appreciate it. Have a great day, Broncos fans, and I will see you next Friday.